Picture this, the most brilliant minds in the galaxy arguing about something they've never experienced, while the one person who actually knows what she's talking about sits quietly in the corner, taking notes and occasionally muttering things like, "Oh, that's adorable," under her breath. This is the story of how Professor Vexithara learned that academic confidence and actual knowledge are two very different things. The Galactic Institute for Xenobiological Studies had a problem. Not the usual kind of problem, like funding cuts or students who thought photosynthesis was a type of camera equipment. No, this was the kind of problem that made even the most seasoned researchers wake up in cold sweats, questioning everything they thought they knew about life in the universe. Deathworlds. The conference room buzzed with the kind of nervous energy typically reserved for root canal procedures or tax audits. 12 of the galaxy's most renowned xenobiologists sat around a crystalline table that probably cost more than most planetary defense budgets, each clutching data tablets like security blankets. "The statistics are impossible," declared Dr. Quillian Hoofthorne, his four eyes bulging in a way that would have been comical if the situation weren't so serious. The Zentorian's typically pristine blue fur was disheveled, suggesting he'd been running his secondary hands through it for hours. A Class 12 Deathworld with a 98% mortality rate for any species attempting colonization. The math simply doesn't add up. Professor Gixlina Thornwhistle, whose species had evolved from what could only be described as very apologetic slugs, oozed forward in her specialized mobility chair. Perhaps we're approaching this from the wrong angle, colleagues. Maybe these so-called death worlds aren't actually inhabited at all. Maybe they're just theoretical constructs designed to test our academic resolve. Theoretical? Dr. Hoofthorne's voice cracked like a teenager asking someone to prom. Gixlina, the energy signatures are right there. These planets are transmitting communication signals. For crying out loud, someone is definitely home. In the corner of the room, largely ignored by the academic chaos, sat a figure that seemed remarkably out of place. While the assembled scientists wore the elaborate robes and ceremonial decorations befitting their stations, she wore simple, dark clothing that looked suspiciously like it had been designed for function rather than academic peacocking. Her name tag read, Dr. Kira Thorne, guest observer, but she hadn't said a word since arriving 3 hours ago. She was human, though none of the other attendees seemed to have processed this rather significant detail. They were too busy being brilliant at each other. The problem, announced Dr. Zilfron Walkstetter, a being who resembled a cross between a praying mantis and a particularly pretentious librarian, is that we're dealing with planets that should theoretically sterilize any organic matter within minutes of exposure. The radiation levels alone would turn most known species into what my people call unfortunate puddles. Precisely, agreed Professor Moonbeam Gentle Whisper, whose species had clearly peaked during their hippie phase and never quite recovered. The atmospheric composition readings indicate toxicity levels that would make even our most advanced hazmat suits weep openly, and that's before we factor in the predatory life forms. Dr. Thorne made a small notation in her tablet. The sound of stylus on screen was barely audible, but somehow it made several of the assembled scientists twitch. "The predatory life forms are what really concern me," continued Dr. Walkstetter, mandibles clicking in what passed for thoughtful contemplation among his species. "Our models suggest creatures with bite forces exceeding 10,000 pounds per square inch, venom that can dissolve titanium, and reflexes that would make a quantum computer feel sluggish. How could any sentient species survive in such conditions?" "Maybe they don't survive," suggested Dr. Blipworth Squeakington, whose name was unfortunately accurate to his vocal capabilities. "Maybe what we're detecting is just automated distress signals from long-dead civilizations." Professor Thornwhistle's eye stalks drooped with what might have been sympathy. "That's actually rather depressing, Blipworth, though it would explain the population density readings." 17 billion life signs on a planet that should, by all logical standards, be completely uninhabitable. It's like finding a thriving metropolis inside an active volcano. Dr. Thorne's stylus paused. For just a moment, something that might have been amusement flickered across her features, but the moment passed quickly, and she returned to her notes. The geological instability alone should be sufficient to prevent any permanent settlement, Dr. Hufthorne was saying, waving his primary hands in increasingly frantic gestures. Tectonic activity that would reshape continents on a monthly basis, weather patterns that include precipitation of actual acid, magnetic field fluctuations that would scramble any technological equipment. Don't forget the atmospheric pressure variations, added Dr. Walkstetter helpfully. Our calculations suggest that organisms would experience crushing forces one moment and explosive decompression the next. It's like trying to live inside a malfunctioning airlock. And the temperature swings! Professor Gentlewhisper's voice rose to what might charitably be called a controlled panic. From freezing to boiling within the span of a few hours, no known biological system could adapt to such extremes. Dr. Thorne cleared her throat. It was a small sound, barely more than a polite cough, but it cut through the academic hysteria like a sonic boom. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the kind of calm that typically preceded either enlightenment or apocalypse. "I couldn't help but notice that you're discussing survival rates for Class 12 Deathworlds." The room fell silent. 12 brilliant minds suddenly focused on the quiet human in the corner, and for the first time since the conference began, they seemed to notice that she was, in fact, present. "Yes, Doctor," Hufthorne said carefully, his four eyes focusing on her with the intensity of someone trying to solve a particularly complex mathematical equation. "We're attempting to understand how any species could possibly survive in such hostile environments. The mortality rates are, well, they're essentially absolute." Dr. Thorne nodded thoughtfully. "And what exactly are you calculating as the survival rate for, say, a typical Class 12 scenario?" "Oh, that's easy, Doctor," Walkstetter said, consulting his tablet with the confidence of someone who had run the numbers 17 times. 0.003%, and that's assuming optimal conditions, full protective gear, and a support team capable of immediate evacuation. "For how long?" Dr. Thorne asked. "How long?" Dr. Hufthorne looked confused. "Well, for survival in general. 0.003% of individuals might survive exposure to a Class 12 environment for any meaningful duration. Any meaningful duration being, roughly 47 minutes, Professor Gentlewhisper supplied helpfully. That's the theoretical maximum for maintaining biological function under such conditions." Dr. Thorne made another note. "Interesting. And these calculations are based on extensive computer modeling." Dr. Walkstetter's mandibles clicked with pride. "We've run over 12,000 simulations using every known biological parameter. The results are absolutely consistent." "Computer modeling," Dr. Thorne repeated slowly, "based on theoretical projections." "The most advanced theoretical projections," Dr. Hufthorne corrected. "We've accounted for every possible variable: environmental toxicity, radiation exposure, atmospheric pressure, temperature fluctuations, predatory threats, geological instability, magnetic field interference, gravitational anomalies, and at least 47 other factors that I can't pronounce without risking a speech impediment." "Doctor." Thorne nodded again, then looked around the room with the expression of someone who had just discovered that the world's leading experts on swimming had never actually seen water. "Has anyone here," she asked with dangerous calm, "ever actually been to a Class 12 Deathworld?" The silence that followed was so complete that you could have heard a pin drop, assuming pins made sounds when dropped in the vacuum of space, which they don't, but the metaphor remains valid. "Well," Professor Thornwhistle said eventually, "that would be inadvisable. The risk factors are simply too extreme for any rational being to consider. Plus, The insurance premiums would be astronomical, added Dr. Squeakington. Dr. Thorne set down her stylus and looked at each of the assembled scientists in turn. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who was about to fundamentally alter the way 12 very smart people understood the universe. The planet I grew up on, she said conversationally, was classified as a Class 15 Deathworld. The room erupted into chaos. Dr. Hoofthorne's 4 eyes bulged so dramatically that they looked in danger of achieving orbit. Professor Gentlewhisper's mouth opened and closed, like a fish experiencing an existential crisis. Dr. Walkstetter's mandibles clicked so rapidly they sounded like a malfunctioning typewriter. "Impossible!" Dr. Hoofthorne finally managed to squeak. "Class 15. Deathworlds are theoretical constructs. They exist only in our most extreme computer models as examples of planets that could never support life. The radiation levels alone would sterilize any organic matter within seconds." Professor Thornwhistle's voice had reached frequencies that were making nearby glassware vibrate ominously. Dr. Thorne smiled. It was not a particularly reassuring expression. The radiation levels were indeed quite high. "We used to joke that you could get a suntan from moonlight. Of course, we also joked that the local wildlife considered aggressive to be a polite way of saying insufficiently murderous, but that's beside the point." "The atmospheric composition," Dr. Walkstetter began. "Oh, the air was definitely trying to kill us," Dr. Thorne agreed cheerfully. "The oxygen levels were toxic. The pressure variations could rupture unprotected lung tissue, and let's not even discuss what happened during storm season. But you adapt. You learn to hold your breath during the really bad patches. You develop a healthy respect for weather patterns, and you always check the atmospheric readings before opening a window. The predatory life forms," Professor Gentlewhisper tried weakly. "Now those were fun." Dr. Thorne's smile widened. "We had these lovely creatures called ripjaws that could bite through titanium plating. Beautiful animals, really. Quite intelligent, too. They learned to open doors after the first few encounters. We had to upgrade to quantum locks just to keep them out of the cafeteria." Dr. Squeakington made a sound that might have been a whimper. "The geological instability made for interesting mornings." Dr. Thorne nodded. "You'd wake up and the mountain range outside your window might be 3 kilometers to the left of where you remembered it. We got very good at flexible architecture and earthquake drills, so many earthquake drills. But the temperature fluctuations." Dr. Hoofthorne's voice had reached the kind of pitch usually reserved for emergency broadcasts. "Our models show variations that would instantly kill any known biological system." Dr. Thorne considered this. "Well, instantly is a bit of an exaggeration. It usually took at least a few seconds. But yes, the temperature swings were dramatic. We had to develop some rather creative solutions for thermal regulation and weather-appropriate clothing. Lots of weather-appropriate clothing. Creative solutions." Professor Thornwhistle's voice was barely a whisper. "Oh, subterranean habitats with multiple redundant life support systems. Atmospheric processors that could handle rapid environmental changes, protective gear that doubled as mobile life support units, emergency shelters that could withstand pretty much anything short of a direct stellar impact. The usual stuff." "The usual stuff?" Dr. Hoofthorne's voice cracked completely. Dr. Thorne looked at him with genuine concern. "Are you feeling all right? You seem a bit stressed." "Stressed? You're describing survival conditions that would challenge the most advanced military units in the galaxy, and you're calling it the usual stuff." "Well," Dr. Thorne said thoughtfully, "I suppose it depends on your perspective. To us, it was just home, though I'll admit the mortality rates were rather high during the learning curve." "What kind of mortality rates?" Dr. Walkstetter asked, his voice barely audible. "Oh, roughly 40% for the first year. But that included stupid deaths. People who tried to pet the ripjaws, or thought they could take a casual stroll during corrosive rain season, or believed the radiation warning signs were just suggestions. Once you weeded out the obviously suicidal behavior, The rates dropped to maybe 15% annually. The silence that followed was so profound that it seemed to have mass. 12 brilliant minds processed this information with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for diffusing antimatter bombs. 15%, Professor Gentlewhisper repeated slowly. Annually. That's higher than the casualty rates for the Galactic War, Dr. Squeakington whispered. The Galactic War was fought by trained military personnel with advanced equipment and tactical support, Dr. Hoofthorne pointed out. You're talking about civilian populations. Oh, we weren't exactly civilians, Dr. Thorne corrected. I mean, we weren't military either, but surviving on a Class 15 Deathworld requires a certain skill set. Everyone learned basic combat techniques, environmental adaptation, emergency medical procedures, equipment maintenance, resource management, and threat assessment. It was part of the standard curriculum. Standard curriculum, Doctor. Walkstetter's mandibles had stopped clicking entirely. Elementary education, Dr. Thorne clarified. We started with the basics around age 5. Simple things like identifying lethal atmospheric conditions, recognizing potentially hostile wildlife, basic first aid for radiation exposure, that sort of thing. At age 5? Professor Thornwhistle's eye stalks were threatening to tie themselves in knots. Well, we had to start somewhere. The mortality rates for unprotected children were simply unacceptable. By age 10, most kids could handle basic survival scenarios. By 15, they were ready for intermediate challenges. And by graduation, she paused, looking around the room at 12 faces that had gone various shades of pale, green, blue, and in one case, a rather alarming shade of purple. By graduation, she continued, students were expected to demonstrate competency in advanced survival techniques. The final examination was particularly comprehensive. What kind of examination? Dr. Hoofthorne asked, though his tone suggested he really didn't want to know. Dr. Thorne's smile returned, and this time it was definitely not reassuring. A solo survival exercise. Students were dropped into a randomly selected hostile environment with minimal equipment and expected to survive for 30 days while completing a series of increasingly difficult challenges. 30 days? Doctor. Squeakington's voice had achieved frequencies that were making nearby computers malfunction. Standard month, Dr. Thorne confirmed. The environments were selected from a database of the most challenging locations we could find. Class 12 to Class 18. Deathworlds, active combat zones, space stations with failing life support, that sort of thing. Class 18. Dr. Walkstetter's mandibles began clicking again, but now they sounded like a machine gun having a nervous breakdown. The theoretical maximum classification for planetary hostility, Professor Gentlewhisper said weakly. Environments so hostile that our computer models can't even process the survival scenarios. Oh, the computer models, Dr. Thorne nodded. Yes, those were always amusing. We used to run them for entertainment during downtime. The results were so pessimistic that we started taking bets on which simulation would predict the fastest death. She consulted her tablet briefly. Speaking of which, your 47-minute survival estimate for Class 12 environments, that's actually quite optimistic. Most of our computer models predicted complete biological failure within 6 to 12 minutes. But you said you lived there, Dr. Hoofthorne protested. For 18 years, Dr. Thorne confirmed. Though I'll admit the first few years were rough. Children have a tendency to make poor decisions when faced with immediate mortal peril. It's a learning process. A learning process, Professor Thornwhistle repeated flatly. The mortality rates improved dramatically once we implemented proper safety protocols, Dr. Thorne continued. Regular drills, mandatory equipment checks, buddy system protocols, emergency response procedures, the basics. Those sound like military procedures, Dr. Walkstetter observed. Military procedures are based on survival procedures, Dr. Thorne corrected. We just had to develop them for civilian populations, including children, which, I'll admit, presented some unique challenges. What kind of challenges? Dr. Squeakington asked, though his voice suggested he was already regretting the question. Well, children tend to be curious and fearless and remarkably creative when it comes to finding new ways to endanger themselves. We had to develop safety protocols that accounted for behaviors like, what happens if a 7-year-old tries to make friends with a ripjaw? Or how do we prevent children from using emergency equipment as playground equipment? And the graduation test you mentioned? Professor Gentlewhisper's voice was barely a whisper. Dr. Thorne's expression grew thoughtful. The graduation test was designed to ensure that students could handle any survival scenario they might encounter. It was comprehensive, challenging, and, well, it had a 93% success rate. 93% success rate. Dr. Hoofthorne's 4 eyes were now moving independently, as if his brain was having trouble processing multiple pieces of information simultaneously. For the graduation test specifically, Dr. Thorne clarified, students who reached that point had already demonstrated basic competency in survival techniques. The test was more about problem-solving under pressure and adapting to unfamiliar environments. Unfamiliar environments, Dr. Walkstetter repeated slowly. More hostile than Class 15 Deathworlds. Different kinds of hostile, Dr. Thorne corrected. The test locations were selected for variety rather than pure lethality. Students needed to demonstrate adaptability, not just survival skills. What kind of variety? Professor Thornwhistle asked, though her tone suggested she was already preparing for the worst. Oh, the usual range. Toxic atmospheres, extreme temperatures, hostile wildlife, unstable terrain, radiation exposure, gravitational anomalies, active volcanic regions, areas with failing technological infrastructure, zones affected by temporal distortions, regions with corrupted quantum fields. She paused, noticing that several of the assembled scientists were now gripping their chairs with the kind of desperate intensity typically reserved for spacecraft experiencing rapid decompression. The goal wasn't to create impossible scenarios, she continued reassuringly. It was to present students with unfamiliar challenges that required creative problem-solving. Most of the test locations were only moderately lethal. Moderately lethal, Dr. Squeakington echoed weakly. Well, yes. Lethality was scored on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being immediate death for unprotected individuals, and 1 being minor discomfort with proper equipment. Most test locations ranked between 6 and 8. 6 to 8, Professor Gentlewhisper repeated. The high-scoring locations were reserved for students who showed exceptional aptitude, Dr. Thorne explained. Advanced placement, you might say. Students who demonstrated superior survival skills were given more challenging scenarios. And what was your graduation test location? Dr. Hoofthorne asked with the kind of morbid fascination usually reserved for examining particularly gruesome traffic accidents. Dr. Thorne consulted her tablet. Let me see. Ah, yes. I was assigned to a Class 17 Deathworld in the Kepler system. Binary star system with unstable solar output. Atmospheric composition that was 80% toxic gases, indigenous life forms that had evolved specifically to hunt anything that moved, and regular seismic activity that rearranged the landscape approximately every 6 hours. That's a nightmare scenario, Dr. Walkstetter whispered. It was certainly challenging, Dr. Thorne agreed. The solar radiation meant that surface exposure was limited to about 20 minutes before equipment failure became inevitable. The toxic atmosphere required constant filtration and processing. The indigenous life forms were remarkably intelligent and persistent, and the seismic activity meant that any shelter or equipment cache had to be mobile or replaceable. How did you survive? Professor Thornwhistle's voice had reached the kind of desperate pitch usually reserved for final examinations. planning, preparation, and adaptability, Dr. Thorne replied. The first week was spent on reconnaissance and resource assessment, mapping the seismic patterns, identifying safe zones, cataloging the local wildlife, testing the effectiveness of various protective measures. The second week focused on establishing sustainable shelter and resource procurement systems. The third week was about optimization and contingency planning. And the fourth week, she paused, and for the first time, her expression became somewhat serious. The fourth week was when things got complicated. Complicated how? Dr. Squeakington asked, though his voice suggested he really didn't want to know. The indigenous life forms figured out my behavioral patterns, Dr. Thorne explained. They started working together to overcome my defensive measures, pack hunting behaviors, coordinated attacks, tool use. It was actually quite impressive from a xenobiological perspective. They were hunting you? Dr. Hoofthorne's voice had climbed to frequencies that were making nearby equipment emit warning beeps. Oh, very actively, Dr. Thorne confirmed. The local apex predators had evolved specifically to hunt the most dangerous prey available. When I arrived, I became the most interesting challenge they'd encountered in quite some time. And you survived for 30 days, Professor Gentlewhisper said weakly. 32 days, actually, Dr. Thorne corrected. The extraction team was delayed by some minor technical difficulties. Equipment failure due to solar radiation, I believe. Nothing serious. Nothing serious, Dr. Walkstetter repeated, in a voice that suggested his grip on reality was beginning to slip. The additional 2 days were actually quite educational, Dr. Thorne continued. It gave me time to conduct some impromptu research on the local ecosystem. I managed to document several species that hadn't been previously catalogued, including the one that had been stalking me for the better part of a week. You were being stalked by an unknown predator species for a week? Dr. Hoofthorne's 4 eyes were now rotating in directions that probably violated several laws of physics. Quite clever, really, Dr. Thorne said, with what might have been admiration. It had learned to mimic the seismic patterns, so I didn't initially realize it was following me. Very patient hunter, excellent camouflage, superior tactical awareness. If I hadn't noticed the anomalous electromagnetic signatures, it probably would have been successful. Successful at what? Professor Thornwhistle's voice cracked. Catching me, presumably, Dr. Thorne replied matter-of-factly. Though I suspect it was more curious than hungry, the local ecosystem provided abundant food sources. I was probably just an interesting novelty. An interesting novelty, Dr. Squeakington repeated numbly. The local predators seemed to view me as a particularly challenging puzzle, Dr. Thorne explained. They kept adapting their hunting strategies based on my defensive responses. It was like playing a very complex, very dangerous game of chess, with opponents who had claws that could shred titanium. And this was considered a passing grade? Dr. Walkstetter's mandibles had stopped clicking entirely, suggesting either complete fascination or total cognitive shutdown. Oh, I got top marks, Dr. Thorne said with obvious pride. The research documentation was particularly well received. The xenobiology department used my findings to publish 17 papers on adaptive predator behaviors in extreme environments. 17 papers, Professor Gentlewhisper echoed weakly. Plus, my survival techniques were incorporated into the standard curriculum for future students, Dr. Thorne added. Several of my innovations became standard equipment for anyone planning to operate in similar environments. Your innovations, Dr. Hoofthorne repeated slowly. Nothing revolutionary, Dr. Thorne said modestly. Just some improvements to existing technology. Better radiation shielding, more efficient atmospheric processes, enhanced early warning systems, improved camouflage techniques, more effective defensive measures. Practical stuff. Practical stuff, Dr. Walkstetter repeated in a voice that suggested he was reconsidering his entire understanding of what constituted practical. Dr. Thorne looked around the room at 12 faces that had progressed through shock, disbelief, horror, and were now approaching what might charitably be called existential crisis. "Is everyone feeling all right?" she asked with genuine concern. "You all look a bit peaked." "Peaked?" Professor Thornwhistle repeated flatly. "She says we look peaked." "Dr. Thorne," Dr. Hoofthorne said carefully, as if addressing someone who might be carrying explosives, "what you're describing, these survival scenarios, they're beyond anything we've ever classified as survivable. Our entire understanding of habitability ratings is based on the assumption that Class 12 environments are essentially uninhabitable." "Oh, they're quite habitable," Dr. Thorne assured him. "You just need proper preparation and appropriate safety measures, plus a reasonable tolerance for ongoing mortal peril." "Ongoing mortal peril," Dr. Squeakington whispered. "Well, yes," Dr. Thorne said reasonably. "Any environment that can't kill you isn't really challenging enough to be educational. The goal is to maintain a reasonable balance between safety and character development." "Character development," Professor Gentlewhisper repeated weakly. "Adversity builds resilience," Dr. Thorne explained. "Students who graduate from truly challenging environments tend to be more adaptable, more resourceful, more capable of handling unexpected situations. It's basic educational psychology." Basic educational psychology," Dr. Walkstetter echoed numbly. Dr. Thorne frowned slightly. "I'm getting the impression that educational standards in this sector are somewhat different from what I'm accustomed to." "Different," Dr. Hoofthorne repeated. "Yes, you could say that our educational standards are different from yours." "What kind of challenges do students typically face in your educational systems?" Dr. Thorne asked with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. The assembled scientists exchanged glances. It was the kind of look typically shared by people who had just realized they'd been discussing nuclear physics with someone who had been building fusion reactors in their basement since childhood. "Well," Professor Thornwhistle said slowly, "our students typically face challenges like standardized examinations." "Standardized examinations," Dr. Thorne repeated thoughtfully. "Testing academic knowledge?" "Yes," Dr. Squeakington said weakly. "Knowledge retention, problem-solving skills, analytical thinking, that sort of thing." "And what happens if they fail these examinations?" Dr. Thorne asked. They have to retake the course," Dr. Walkstetter replied. "They don't die?" "No!" Dr. Hoofthorne's voice reached frequencies that were making nearby glassware vibrate. "They don't die. Failure of academic examinations does not typically result in death." Dr. Thorne considered this. "That seems inefficient." "Inefficient." Professor Gentlewhisper's voice had achieved the kind of strangled quality usually associated with people who were questioning their entire worldview. "Well, if there are no real consequences for failure, how do you ensure that students develop proper motivation and resilience?" Dr. Thorne asked reasonably. "We use grading systems," Dr. Squeakington said weakly. "Grading systems," Dr. Thorne repeated. "And these grading systems provide sufficient motivation for students to develop survival skills." "They develop academic skills," Dr. Walkstetter corrected. "Knowledge, analytical thinking, research capabilities." "But not survival skills," Dr. Thorne observed. "Most of our students don't need survival skills," Dr. Hoofthorne pointed out. "They live in safe, controlled environments with reliable life support, medical care, and emergency services." "Doctor?" Thorne looked around the room with an expression that suggested she was trying to process a completely alien concept. "Safe, controlled environments," she repeated slowly. "Without ongoing mortal peril." "Without ongoing mortal peril," Professor Thornwhistle confirmed. "How do they develop character?" Dr. Thorne asked with obvious confusion. "Through personal growth and social interaction," Dr. Squeakington suggested weakly. "Personal growth," Dr. Thorne repeated. "Without life-threatening challenges." "Yes," Dr. Hoofthorne's voice had reached the kind of desperate pitch usually reserved for people explaining why jumping off cliffs was a bad idea. Personal growth without life-threatening challenges. Dr. Thorne frowned. That seems limited. Limited? Dr. Walkstetter's mandibles began clicking again, but now they sounded like a machine trying to process information that exceeded its design parameters. Well, how do you determine if someone is truly capable of handling difficult situations if they've never been in any actual danger? Dr. Thorne asked reasonably. We use simulations, Professor Gentlewhisper said weakly. Simulations, Dr. Thorne repeated thoughtfully, like the computer models you were using to calculate survival rates for Class 12 environments. The silence that followed was so complete that it seemed to have achieved its own gravitational field. The computer models that predicted a 0.003% survival rate for 47 minutes, Dr. Thorne continued helpfully, for environments that I lived in for 18 years. Yes, Dr. Hoofthorne said weakly, those computer models. And these simulations are used to evaluate student capabilities, Dr. Thorne asked. Among other things, Dr. Squeakington confirmed. Dr. Thorne nodded slowly. So your educational system is based on theoretical knowledge evaluated through simulated scenarios with no actual risk of failure beyond academic inconvenience. When you put it like that, Professor Thornwhistle said weakly, it sounds rather sheltered. Sheltered, Dr. Thorne repeated. She seemed to be trying the word out, like someone tasting an unfamiliar food. Yes, I suppose sheltered is one way to describe it. And your educational system, Doctor, Walkstetter said carefully, is based on practical experience in life-threatening situations, with actual risk of death for students who fail to develop adequate survival skills. That's a bit of an oversimplification, Dr. Thorne said modestly. We also had theoretical coursework, mathematics, sciences, literature, history, arts. The survival training was just integrated into the overall curriculum. Integrated, Dr. Hoofthorne repeated weakly. Well, yes. It's difficult to separate academic learning from practical application when you're living in an environment that can kill you if you make a mistake. Students tend to pay more attention to physics lessons when understanding momentum could prevent them from being eaten by a ripjaw. Being eaten by a ripjaw, Professor Gentlewhisper echoed numbly. Plus, practical experience provides excellent context for theoretical knowledge, Dr. Thorne continued. Chemistry becomes much more interesting when you're trying to analyze the toxicity of local water sources. Biology takes on new meaning when you're studying the hunting patterns of creatures that view you as a potential meal. Mathematics becomes essential when you're calculating resource requirements for survival scenarios. Resource requirements for survival scenarios, Dr. Squeakington whispered. And literature, Doctor. Thorne added thoughtfully, becomes remarkably relevant when you're trying to understand the psychological impact of extended isolation in hostile environments. Some of the classic works take on entirely new meaning when you're reading them while hiding from predators in a radiation-shielded bunker. Literature, Dr. Walkstetter repeated. Read while hiding from predators. Oh, reading was encouraged during downtime, Dr. Thorne explained. Mental stimulation was considered essential for maintaining psychological health during extended survival scenarios. We had quite an extensive library. A library, Dr. Hoofthorne said weakly, in a survival bunker. Multiple libraries, Dr. Thorne corrected, distributed throughout the various safe zones, plus portable units for field operations. Knowledge preservation was considered a priority. Knowledge preservation, Professor Thornwhistle repeated. Well, yes. What's the point of surviving if you don't maintain your intellectual development? Dr. Thorne asked reasonably. She looked around the room at 12 faces that had progressed beyond shock and horror into what might charitably be called philosophical vertigo. I'm getting the impression, she said gently, that there might be some fundamental differences between our respective educational philosophies. Fundamental differences, Dr. Squeakington echoed weakly. Perhaps, Doctor. Thorne suggested we could discuss how these differences might affect your calculations regarding Deathworld survival rates. Our calculations, Dr. Walkstetter said slowly, are based on the assumption that the beings attempting to survive in hostile environments would have educational backgrounds similar to our own. Educational backgrounds that don't include survival training, Dr. Thorne observed, or experience with hostile environments, Dr. Hoofthorne added weakly, or practical application of theoretical knowledge under life-threatening conditions, Professor Gentlewhisper continued, or character development through adversity, Dr. Squeakington whispered, or integration of academic learning with survival skills, Professor Thornwhistle concluded. Dr. Thorne nodded thoughtfully. So your survival rate calculations are based on the performance of individuals who have never actually been trained to survive hostile conditions. That's essentially correct, Dr. Walkstetter admitted. And you've been using these calculations to determine the habitability ratings for planetary environments throughout the galaxy, Dr. Thorne continued. Yes, Dr. Hoofthorne said weakly, including the classification of planets as uninhabitable because your computer models predict that untrained individuals would die within minutes of exposure, Dr. Thorne concluded. When you put it like that, Professor Gentlewhisper said weakly, our entire classification system seems rather limited. Limited, Dr. Thorne agreed, though I suppose it's understandable. If you've never encountered anyone who was actually trained to survive in hostile environments, your calculations would naturally assume that survival was impossible. She paused, consulting her tablet again. Which brings up an interesting question. How many inhabited planets have been classified as uninhabitable because of these calculations? The assembled scientists exchanged glances that conveyed the kind of dawning horror typically reserved for people who had just realized they'd been using the wrong formula for critically important calculations. According to our current database, Dr. Walkstetter said slowly, approximately 47,000 planets have been classified as Class 10 or higher death worlds, making them unsuitable for colonization or exploration. 47,000, Dr. Thorne repeated thoughtfully. And how many of those planets show signs of indigenous life? Signs of indigenous life? Dr. Hoofthorne's voice had dropped to a whisper. Communication signals, energy signatures, technological activities, the kind of signs that would indicate inhabited worlds. The silence that followed was so profound that it seemed to bend space-time. 38,412, Professor Thornwhistle finally whispered. 38,000 inhabited planets, Dr. Thorne said slowly, that have been classified as uninhabitable. Oh no, Dr. Squeakington whispered. Oh no, oh no, oh no. It gets worse, Dr. Walkstetter said weakly. We've been actively warning other species away from those systems, official advisories recommending that they be avoided entirely, because contact with the inhabitants would be impossible due to the hostile environmental conditions, Professor Gentlewhisper added with growing horror. Hostile environmental conditions that you calculated based on the assumption that the inhabitants had no survival training, Dr. Thorne observed. We've been treating 38,000 inhabited worlds as quarantine zones. Dr. Hoofthorne's voice reached frequencies that made nearby electronics emit alarmed beeping sounds. Dr. Thorne made a note in her tablet. That would explain why first contact protocols in this sector seem so limited. Limited? Dr. Squeakington asked weakly. Well, if you've been avoiding contact with anyone who lives in challenging environments, you'd naturally develop protocols based on interactions with species from safe, controlled worlds, Dr. Thorne explained reasonably. Safe, controlled worlds with educational systems that don't include survival training, Dr. Walkstetter added numbly. Which would explain why this conference exists, Dr. Thorne continued. You're trying to understand how life could exist in environments that your calculations say are unsurvivable, but your calculations are based on survival rates for individuals who have never been trained to survive such environments. It's a completely circular logic system, Professor Thornwhistle said with dawning realization. We've been calculating survival rates based on the assumption that survival is impossible, then using those calculations to prove that survival is impossible. While actively avoiding contact with anyone who might have actual experience surviving in such environments, Professor Gentlewhisper added, which means our entire understanding of planetary habitability is based on... Dr. Hoofthorne trailed off. Essentially nothing. Dr. Thorne finished helpfully. The room fell silent again. 12 brilliant minds contemplated the implications of discovering that their life's work had been based on fundamentally flawed assumptions. Dr. Thorne, Doctor, Walkstetter said carefully, how many humans are there? Currently, about 43 billion, distributed across roughly 1,800 worlds. 1,800 worlds? Dr. Squeakington's voice cracked. Give or take a few dozen. We're still cataloguing some of the newer settlements. Expansion has been rather rapid in recent decades. And these worlds are, Professor Thornwhistle asked weakly, primarily Class 12 through Class 18 Deathworlds, Doctor. Thorne replied matter-of-factly, though we do have a few Class 10 settlements for people who prefer more relaxed living conditions. Relaxed living conditions, Dr. Hoofthorne repeated numbly. Class 10 environments are considered quite comfortable, Dr. Thorne explained. Minimal hostile wildlife, stable atmospheric conditions, manageable radiation levels, predictable weather patterns. Some people find them a bit boring, but they're popular with retirees and families with very young children. Class 10 environments are some of the most hostile planets in our database, Dr. Walkstetter pointed out weakly. Different perspectives, Dr. Thorne said with a shrug. What seems impossible to one species might be perfectly manageable to another. Perfectly manageable, Professor Gentlewhisper echoed. Though I will admit, Dr. Thorne continued, the expansion has created some interesting logistical challenges. Coordinating supply lines across 1,800 worlds is remarkably complex, especially when many of those worlds are classified as impossible to reach by galactic navigation standards. Impossible to reach? Dr. Squeakington asked weakly. Oh, the environmental hazards make standard navigation extremely difficult, Dr. Thorne explained. Solar radiation that interferes with quantum navigation systems, magnetic anomalies that scramble conventional sensors, gravitational fluctuations that make hyperspace jumps unpredictable. Standard starships aren't really designed to operate in such conditions. But human starships are? Dr. Hoofthorne asked. Well, we had to make some modifications, Dr. Thorne admitted. Enhanced shielding, redundant navigation systems, improved life support, emergency protocols for equipment failure in hostile space. Plus, our pilots receive rather extensive training in hazardous navigation techniques. Hazardous navigation techniques, Dr. Walkstetter repeated. Basic stuff, really. How to navigate using stellar landmarks when electronic systems fail, emergency procedures for hyperspace anomalies, survival protocols for stranded vessels, that sort of thing. Survival protocols for stranded vessels, Professor Thornwhistle echoed weakly. Space is dangerous, Dr. Thorne pointed out reasonably. Equipment fails, hyperspace routes shift, emergency situations arise. Any competent pilot needs to know how to handle unexpected problems, and your definition of competent pilot includes survival training for scenarios that we would classify as catastrophic emergencies, Professor Gentlewhisper observed. Catastrophic emergencies happen, Dr. Thorne said with a shrug. The goal is to ensure that they don't become fatal emergencies. Fatal emergencies, Dr. Squeakington whispered. Dr. Thorne looked around the room with an expression of growing concern. Are you certain everyone is feeling all right? Several of you appear to be experiencing some form of shock. Shock, Dr. Hoofthorne repeated weakly. Yes, shock is probably an accurate description of our current condition. Perhaps, Dr. Thorne suggested gently, we should take a break. This has been quite a lot of information to process. A break, Dr. Walkstetter agreed numbly. Yes, a break would be advisable. Before we break, Professor Thornwhistle said weakly, could you answer one more question? Of course. The graduation test you mentioned, the 30-day survival exercise in randomly selected hostile environments. What was the purpose of that test? Dr. Thorne considered the question. It was designed to ensure that graduating students could handle any situation they might encounter during their careers. Their careers doing what? Professor Gentlewhisper asked. Whatever they chose to do, Dr. Thorne replied. Some became researchers like me, others went into engineering, agriculture, arts, commerce, exploration, education, the usual range of career paths. But they all had to pass a survival test that involved 30 days alone in environments that we classify as unsurvivable, Dr. Squeakington said weakly. Well, yes, basic competency standards. You can't really know if someone is capable of handling responsibility until you've seen how they perform under pressure. Under pressure, Dr. Hoofthorne repeated. Life-threatening pressure, where failure means death, Dr. Walkstetter clarified. That's the most effective kind of pressure for evaluation purposes, Dr. Thorne agreed. Simulated scenarios don't provide the same level of motivation. The room fell silent once more. 12 brilliant minds struggled to process the implications of a society where passing a survival test that would kill most galactic citizens was considered a basic requirement for any career. Dr. Thorne, Professor Thornwhistle said very quietly, what do you do for a living? I'm a xenobiologist, Dr. Thorne replied. I study alien life forms and their adaptation strategies in extreme environments. And your research involves, Dr. Squeakington asked weakly, field studies primarily. I spend most of my time visiting different worlds to observe local ecosystems and document species behaviors. It's quite interesting work. What kind of worlds do you visit for your research? Dr. Walkstetter asked, with the tone of someone who already suspected the answer. Oh, the usual range. Class 15 to Class 20, environments mostly. Occasionally I'll get assigned to something truly challenging, like a Class 25 system, but those are relatively rare. Class 25, Dr. Hoofthorne's voice achieved frequencies that made nearby glassware begin to vibrate ominously. Theoretical maximum hostility ratings, Dr. Thorne explained. Environments where the laws of physics seem to be actively working against the survival of organic matter. Fascinating from a research perspective, though the equipment maintenance requirements are rather intensive. Equipment maintenance requirements, Professor Gentlewhisper repeated numbly. Radiation exposure tends to degrade electronic components rather quickly, Dr. Thorne said matter-of-factly. Plus, the local wildlife on Class 25 worlds tends to be remarkably creative when it comes to destroying anything that wasn't specifically designed to resist their attention. Their attention, Dr. Squeakington whispered. Oh, they're usually quite curious about visitors, Dr. Thorne said, with what might have been fondness. Intelligent predators tend to view new arrivals as interesting puzzles to solve. It makes for dynamic research conditions. Dynamic research conditions, Dr. Walkstetter echoed weakly. Though I'll admit, Dr. Thorne continued, the paperwork can be rather tedious. Research proposals for Class 20 and above environments require rather extensive safety documentation. Safety documentation, Professor Thornwhistle repeated. Standard protocols, Dr. Thorne explained. Equipment manifests, emergency procedures, communication schedules, extraction contingencies, medical preparations, that sort of thing. The review process can take weeks. Weeks to approve research in environments that would kill us in minutes, Dr. Hoofthorne observed weakly. Well, bureaucracy is the same everywhere, Dr. Thorne said with a shrug, though I suppose the consequences for incomplete paperwork are rather more severe when you're dealing with genuinely lethal research sites. She glanced at her tablet. Speaking of which, I should probably mention that I'm currently on a research assignment. Research assignment? Dr. Squeakington asked, with the tone of someone who really didn't want to know. Standard xenobiological survey, Dr. Thorne explained. I'm studying adaptive behaviors in academic species that have developed in artificially safe environments. The silence that followed was so complete that it seemed to achieve its own event horizon. Academic species, Dr. Walkstetter said slowly, in artificially safe environments. Species that have developed advanced intellectual capabilities without corresponding survival skills, Dr. Thorne clarified. It's a relatively uncommon evolutionary pattern, but this sector provides an excellent case study. This sector, Professor Gentlewhisper repeated weakly. Dozens of species that have achieved spaceflight and advanced scientific capabilities while living in completely controlled environments. Dr. Thorne continued enthusiastically. Fascinating adaptation strategies. Though the survival rates for individuals exposed to even mildly challenging conditions are remarkably poor. You're studying US, Dr. Hoofthorne said with dawning horror. Among others, Dr. Thorne confirmed cheerfully, this conference is providing excellent data on behavioral patterns when academic species are confronted with information that contradicts their fundamental assumptions about reality. Behavioral patterns, Professor Thornwhistle repeated numbly. The psychological adaptation mechanisms are particularly interesting, Dr. Thorne noted, making another entry in her tablet. Progressive stages of disbelief, shock, cognitive dissonance, and eventual acceptance, though some individuals seem to get stuck in the disbelief stage. Stuck in the disbelief stage? Dr. Squeakington echoed weakly. Dr. Walkstetter, for example, Dr. Thorne observed, has been experiencing mandible paralysis for the past several minutes. Classic stress response for his species when confronted with information that exceeds their processing capabilities. Dr. Walkstetter's mandibles remained motionless. Whether this was due to shock or a conscious decision to avoid confirming Dr. Thorne's observation was unclear. And Professor Gentlewhisper's eye stalks have been exhibiting involuntary tremors, Dr. Thorne continued. Fascinating stress adaptation for a species that evolved in low-stimulus environments. You're taking notes on our psychological breakdown, Dr. Hoofthorne said weakly. Research is research, Dr. Thorne said with a shrug. Though I'll admit this data set is exceptionally rich. Most academic species don't receive such dramatic challenges to their worldview. Most academic species, Professor Thornwhistle repeated. Well, this sector is rather unique, Dr. Thorne explained. Most regions of the galaxy include at least some contact between species from challenging environments and species from safe environments. The intellectual isolation here is quite remarkable. Intellectual isolation, Dr. Squeakington whispered. 38,000 inhabited worlds that have been completely cut off from galactic contact due to environmental classifications based on flawed survival calculations, Dr. Thorne noted. It's created a fascinating natural experiment in isolated societal development. Natural experiment, Dr. Walkstetter managed to say, his mandibles clicking weakly. The academic species in this sector have developed remarkably sophisticated theoretical frameworks while having virtually no contact with practical applications, Dr. Thorne continued. It's like discovering a civilization of brilliant mathematicians who have never encountered actual numbers. Brilliant mathematicians who have never encountered actual numbers, Professor Gentlewhisper repeated numbly. The implications for educational theory are staggering, Dr. Thorne said enthusiastically. This could revolutionize our understanding of how intellectual development is affected by isolation from practical experience. Revolutionize, Dr. Hoofthorne echoed weakly. Oh, yes, Dr. Thorne confirmed. This research could fundamentally change how we approach education throughout human space. The contrast between theoretical development in safe environments versus practical application in challenging conditions is remarkable. Throughout human space, Professor Thornwhistle said slowly, 1,800 worlds, with populations that have been trained from childhood to survive in environments that this sector's species consider unsurvivable, Dr. Thorne clarified. The educational implications are fascinating. Educational implications, Dr. Squeakington whispered. Dr. Thorne paused, looking around the room at 12 faces that had progressed beyond shock into what could only be described as existential vertigo. I'm getting the impression, she said gently, that this information is somewhat overwhelming. Overwhelming, Dr. Walkstetter confirmed weakly. Perhaps, Dr. Thorne suggested, we should discuss the practical applications of this knowledge. Practical applications? Dr. Hoothorne asked, with the tone of someone who was afraid to know. Well, now that we've established that your survival calculations are based on fundamentally flawed assumptions, we could work together to develop more accurate habitability assessments, Dr. Thorne explained reasonably. More accurate habitability assessments, Professor Gentlewhisper repeated. Plus, we could establish proper first contact protocols for the 38,000 worlds that have been incorrectly classified as uninhabitable, Dr. Thorne continued. First contact protocols, Professor Thornwhistle echoed weakly, and we could develop exchange programs between human educational institutions and academic institutions in this sector, Dr. Thorne added enthusiastically. The comparative studies would be invaluable. Exchange programs, Dr. Squeakington whispered with obvious terror. Imagine the learning opportunities, Dr. Thorne continued. Students from safe environments could gain practical experience in challenging conditions, while students from challenging environments could study advanced theoretical frameworks. Students from safe environments, Dr. Walkstetter said slowly, gaining practical experience in Class 18 Deathworlds. With proper preparation and supervision, of course, Dr. Thorne assured him. We're not barbarians. Safety protocols would be essential. Safety protocols, Dr. Hoothorne repeated numbly. Standard precautions, Dr. Thorne explained. Basic survival training, appropriate equipment, experienced guides, emergency backup procedures, nothing too complicated. Basic survival training for environments that would kill us in minutes, Professor Gentlewhisper observed weakly. Well, you'd need to start with fundamental skills, Dr. Thorne agreed. Hazard recognition, emergency response, equipment maintenance, threat assessment, basic combat techniques, environmental adaptation. The standard curriculum, Professor Thornwhistle repeated. Though the training program would need to be rather intensive, Dr. Thorne admitted. Most species from safe environments would require several years of preparation before they could handle even basic survival scenarios. Several years, Dr. Squeakington echoed weakly. Plus ongoing education, Dr. Thorne added. Survival skills require constant practice to maintain proficiency. It's not the kind of knowledge you can learn once and forget about. Constant practice, Dr. Walkstetter said numbly. But the educational benefits would be enormous, Dr. Thorne said enthusiastically. Students who complete survival training show dramatic improvements in problem-solving skills, stress management, adaptability, and practical application of theoretical knowledge. Dramatic improvements, Dr. Hoothorne repeated weakly. Plus, the mortality rates are quite reasonable, Doctor. Thorne added reassuringly, with proper training and supervision, we could probably keep student fatalities below 10% annually. 10% annually, Professor Gentlewhisper whispered. That's actually quite good for cross-species educational programs in challenging environments, Dr. Thorne explained. Historical mortality rates for unprepared individuals were much higher. Much higher, Professor Thornwhistle repeated numbly. But those were unsupervised exposures to hostile conditions, Dr. Thorne clarified. Proper educational programs would include safety measures, medical support, emergency protocols, and experienced instructors. Experienced instructors, Dr. Squeakington echoed weakly. Humans who have completed advanced survival training and demonstrated competency in educational techniques, Dr. Thorne explained. Plus, we'd start with relatively safe environments. Class 10 or 11 Deathworlds, maybe. Nothing too challenging for beginning students? Class 10 Deathworlds, Dr. Walkstetter said slowly, as beginning exercises. Well, you have to start somewhere, Dr. Thorne said reasonably. It would be irresponsible to put untrained students into genuinely dangerous situations. The room fell silent once more. 12 brilliant minds contemplated the implications of an educational system where Class 10 Deathworlds were considered appropriate for beginners. Dr. Hufthorne said very quietly, how long have humans been expanding into space? About 200 years, Dr. Thorne replied. Though the first century was rather slow-going, we hadn't developed effective survival techniques for space-based environments. Space-based environments, Professor Gentlewhisper repeated weakly. Space is remarkably hostile, Dr. Thorne explained. Vacuum conditions, radiation exposure, thermal extremes, micrometeorite impacts, equipment failure scenarios. It took quite a while to develop proper safety protocols. Proper safety protocols for space travel, Professor Thornwhistle said numbly. Plus, early spacecraft design was rather primitive, Dr. Thorne continued. Insufficient shielding, inadequate life support, poor emergency systems. The mortality rates for early space explorers were quite high. How high? Dr. Squeakington asked weakly. Oh, roughly 60% for the first generation of interstellar travelers, Dr. Thorne said matter-of-factly. But that improved dramatically once we developed better technology and training programs. 60%, Dr. Walkstetter repeated. Early space exploration was quite dangerous, Dr. Thorne explained. Equipment failures, navigation errors, hostile encounters, resource depletion. Lots of ways for things to go wrong. Hostile encounters? Dr. Hufthorne asked with obvious dread. Oh, the usual challenges, Dr. Thorne said with a wave of her hand. Pirates, aggressive alien species, territorial disputes, resource conflicts. Space politics can be rather complicated. Space politics, Professor Gentlewhisper echoed weakly. Though most of the hostile encounters were resolved through negotiation, Dr. Thorne added reassuringly. Humans tend to prefer diplomatic solutions when possible. When possible? Professor Thornwhistle asked. Well, sometimes diplomatic solutions aren't viable, Dr. Thorne explained reasonably. Some species respond better to displays of strength than to peaceful overtures. Displays of strength, Dr. Squeakington whispered. Basic conflict resolution, Dr. Thorne said with a shrug. Most intelligent species respect competence and determination. Once they understand that humans are capable of defending themselves, negotiations usually proceed more smoothly. Defending themselves, Dr. Walkstetter repeated weakly. Standard self-defense capabilities, Dr. Thorne clarified. Nothing excessive, just enough to discourage aggressive behavior and establish mutual respect. What kind of self-defense capabilities? Dr. Hufthorne asked with the tone of someone who already suspected the answer would be horrifying. Oh, the usual range, Dr. Thorne said casually. Personal weapons training, tactical awareness, combat techniques, strategic planning, technological countermeasures, basic stuff for anyone operating in potentially hostile environments. Combat techniques, Professor Gentlewhisper repeated numbly. Well, space is dangerous, Dr. Thorne pointed out. You never know when you might encounter aggressive wildlife, hostile aliens, or equipment malfunctions that require immediate action. Equipment malfunctions that require combat techniques, Professor Thornwhistle asked weakly. Sometimes malfunctioning equipment becomes hostile, Dr. Thorne explained. Artificial intelligences with corrupted programming, automated defense systems with faulty targeting, mining equipment that's been reprogrammed by aggressive alien species. You need to be prepared for various scenarios. Various scenarios, Dr. Squeakington echoed. The key is adaptability, Dr. Thorne continued. You can't predict exactly what kind of problems you'll encounter, so you need to be prepared for a wide range of possibilities. A wide range of possibilities involving combat, Dr. Walkstetter observed weakly. Combat is just one tool among many, Dr. Thorne said reassuringly. Diplomacy, negotiation, strategic withdrawal, technological solutions, environmental manipulation. The goal is to use the most appropriate response for each situation. Environmental manipulation, Dr. Hoofthorne asked with growing alarm. Sometimes you can resolve conflicts by changing the environment rather than engaging directly with hostile forces, Dr. Thorne explained. Atmospheric modifications, gravitational adjustments, electromagnetic interference, terrain restructuring, creative problem-solving. Terrain restructuring, Professor Gentlewhisper whispered. Basic engineering applications, Dr. Thorne clarified. Sometimes the simplest solution to a complex problem involves making the environment more suitable for your needs. Making the environment more suitable, Professor Thornwhistle repeated numbly. Terraforming techniques, atmospheric processes, gravity generators, climate control systems, Dr. Thorne listed. Standard colonization equipment for establishing settlements on challenging worlds. Standard colonization equipment, Dr. Squeakington echoed weakly. Though the engineering requirements can be rather complex for Class 15 and above environments, Dr. Thorne admitted. The more hostile the planet, the more sophisticated your technological solutions need to be. Technological solutions for Class 15 environments, Dr. Walkstetter said slowly. Plus, you need backup systems for when the primary technology fails, Dr. Thorne added. Equipment breakdown is inevitable in hostile conditions, so redundancy is essential. Redundancy, Dr. Hoofthorne repeated. Multiple backup systems, distributed resources, alternative power sources, emergency protocols, Dr. Thorne explained. The goal is to ensure that technical failures don't become survival crises. Technical failures that could become survival crises, Professor Gentlewhisper observed weakly. Well, when you're living in an environment that can kill you if your life support fails, equipment reliability becomes rather important. Dr. Thorne pointed out reasonably. Rather important, Professor Thornwhistle repeated numbly. Dr. Thorne glanced at her tablet and frowned slightly. I'm afraid I should probably wrap up this session soon. My research schedule includes a field expedition that I need to prepare for. Field expedition? Dr. Squeakington asked weakly. Standard xenobiological survey, Dr. Thorne explained. I'm investigating adaptive behaviors in silicon-based life forms that evolved in high-pressure methane environments. High-pressure methane environments, Dr. Walkstetter repeated numbly. Class 19 system, Dr. Thorne clarified. Should be quite interesting. The preliminary data suggests that the local organisms have developed some remarkable survival strategies. Class 19, Dr. Hoofthorne whispered. The really fascinating part is that they appear to have achieved a form of technological civilization despite the environmental challenges. Dr. Thorne continued enthusiastically. Engineering solutions that work in methane atmospheres under crushing pressure. The implications for alternative technological development are staggering. Alternative technological development, Professor Gentlewhisper echoed weakly. Plus, initial communication attempts suggest they might be interested in establishing diplomatic contact, Dr. Thorne added. First contact scenarios are always exciting. First contact, Professor Thornwhistle repeated numbly. Though the environmental requirements for face-to-face meetings will be rather challenging, Dr. Thorne admitted, I'll need specialized equipment for operating in methane atmospheres under extreme pressure. Specialized equipment, Dr. Squeakington whispered. Standard environmental suits with enhanced pressure resistance and atmospheric processing capabilities, Dr. Thorne explained. Plus backup life support, emergency communication systems, and survival gear in case of equipment failure. Survival gear for Class 19 environments, Dr. Workstetter said weakly. Basic precautions, Dr. Thorne assured him. Though I'll admit the pressure differential could be problematic if there's a suit breach. Explosive decompression in methane atmospheres tends to be rather unpleasant. Rather unpleasant, Dr. Hoofthorne repeated numbly. But the research opportunities are worth the risk, Dr. Thorne said enthusiastically. Silicon-based life forms that have achieved technological civilization, the xenobiological implications are incredible. She stood up and gathered her notes. This has been a fascinating discussion. Your perspectives on survival calculations have been quite illuminating. Illuminating, Professor Gentlewhisper said weakly. I'll make sure to include your theoretical frameworks in my research report, Dr. Thorne continued. The contrast between calculated survival rates and actual survival performance should make for an excellent case study. Case study, Professor Thornwhistle echoed numbly. Plus, the data on academic species responses to paradigm-shifting information will be invaluable, Dr. Thorne added. This conference has provided some excellent examples of cognitive adaptation under stress. Cognitive adaptation under stress, Dr. Squeakington whispered. Dr. Thorne paused at the door and looked back at the assembled scientists, who were still sitting in various states of shock and existential crisis. Oh, and one more thing, she said cheerfully. That graduation test I mentioned, the 30-day survival exercise in hostile environments? 12 faces turned toward her with expressions of dawning dread. That was actually the easy part of our education system. She smiled brightly. The really challenging stuff didn't start until graduate school.